In a quiet Chicago suburb, a respected police officer had built a life that seemed solid. She wore the badge with pride, dedicated herself to the job, and was known for her discipline and professionalism. Her husband, a man of few words, worked long hours in construction, providing for their family. They had a teenage son, a boy with quiet eyes and a mind that worked in ways others often didn't understand. To neighbors, they were just another family in an ordinary home, the type you might pass on the street without a second thought. But on this night, everything changed. What could drive a man to this? What could he have seen? What could have happened that led him to do what he did? The truth would shake an entire city, leaving people questioning how well they really knew those around them. Before we continue, if you want to hear more cases like this, cases that leave you questioning everything, be sure to subscribe. Because what you're about to hear is only the beginning. To neighbors, friends, and colleagues, they were the kind of family people admired. A decorated police officer, a hard-working father, and their son, a quiet, gentle boy who kept to himself. In a quiet Chicago suburb, they seemed to have built a peaceful life. But inside their home, something was deeply wrong. The husband was a man of few words, a construction worker who left home before sunrise and returned long after dark. He wasn't the kind to cause trouble. He wasn't the kind to ask too many questions, but that didn't mean he was blind. He had always been the quiet, steady force in the family. He never argued. He never pushed back. When his wife spoke, he listened. When she made decisions, he let her lead. And when she told him how to parent their son, he trusted that she knew best. But as the years passed, small moments began to gnaw at him. The way their son flinched at sudden sounds. The way he avoided eye contact whenever his mother was near. The way he clung to routines so rigidly, as if any deviation would send him spiraling. And then, there were the nights. Nights when his wife would come home late, when she would lock herself in the bedroom and refuse to talk, when she would wake up in the middle of the night and pace the hallway, whispering into her phone. He had asked once, just once, who she was talking to. Her answer was quick, sharp, work. He never asked again. She had spent years building her reputation. She was tough, fearless, the kind of officer who never hesitated, never backed down. She had arrested some of the city's worst criminals. She had testified in high-profile cases. She had earned respect. But she had another side, one that only her family saw. She ran her home like she ran her precinct, strict, unyielding, no room for excuses, no room for emotion. Her son's autism? It wasn't an excuse. In her eyes, he needed discipline, not coddling. And her husband, he needed to stop interfering. Neighbors would later say they sometimes heard her voice carrying through the walls, sharp, clipped commands. They never heard the husband raise his voice, and they never heard the boy speak at all. He was different. His teachers noticed it. His classmates noticed it. But no one ever said much about it. He didn't cause trouble. He didn't act out. He simply existed. He liked patterns. He liked numbers. He liked things that made sense. But people were unpredictable. And his mother was the most unpredictable of all. He knew when to stay quiet, when not to move, when to avoid eye contact. He knew that certain tones of voice meant he should leave the room, and he knew that no matter what happened, he wasn't supposed to talk about it. So he didn't. Not when teachers asked why he had bruises on his arms, not when his father asked if everything was okay, and not on the night that everything changed. It was late, past midnight. The house was silent. The husband had been asleep for hours, exhausted from another long shift. But something woke him. At first, he wasn't sure what it was. A voice? A noise? He sat up, listening. And then he saw it. The light from his son's room spilling into the hallway, the door slightly ajar. He got up, walked toward it. He didn't know what he was expecting. Maybe his son having trouble sleeping. Maybe nothing at all. But when he pushed the door open, what he saw made his blood run cold. For a moment, no one moved. His wife turned to him, eyes wide, caught in the act. His son, frozen, unmoving, refused to meet his gaze. And then, she spoke. "You don't understand." But he did. He understood everything. For years, her routine had been predictable. Early morning shifts, evenings spent at home, weekends dedicated to their son. But then, things changed. It started with late nights. At first, it was once a week, then twice, then nearly every night. Always the same excuse, work. Extra shifts, a big case. She was a cop after all. It made sense. Or at least, it should have. He tried not to overthink it, tried not to be the jealous husband, but something wasn't right. The way she avoided eye contact, the way she dismissed his questions, the way she flinched when he touched her shoulder. And then, there were the smells, faint but there, a mix of something sterile, like disinfectant, and something else, something he couldn't quite place. He told himself he was imagining things, that stress was making him paranoid. But then, he noticed their son. His son had never been talkative, but now he barely spoke at all, not even to his father, not even about the things he loved. His routines became even more rigid. His hands always clasped together, knuckles white. And at night, The rocking, back and forth, the same motion, over and over again. The husband asked him if something was wrong. The boy didn't answer, just looked down, avoided his gaze. And then one night, the husband walked past his son's room and heard something strange. A whisper, soft, repetitive. A single word murmured under his breath. Stop. Over and over again. Stop, stop, stop. The husband stepped inside, knelt beside him, asked him what he meant, what he was afraid of. The boy didn't look up, didn't speak, just kept rocking, whispering that single word. Stop. The final piece of the puzzle came late one night. She had fallen asleep with her phone in her hand. He hadn't meant to look, but when a message flashed on the screen, he couldn't ignore it. His heart pounded. He hesitated. Then slowly, carefully, he unlocked her phone. The messages were short, vague, but the meaning was clear. We have to be careful. Not at the house. He doesn't know anything. His stomach twisted. At first, he thought it was an affair, a betrayal. But as he read further, the messages took a darker turn. The boy is compliant, right? His blood ran cold. Who was asking about his son, and why? Was his wife hiding an affair, or was it something much worse? Sleep didn't come easily anymore. Not with the questions, not with the doubt, not with the feeling, deep in his gut, that something was horribly wrong. That night, the rain came in waves. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. He had been watching her for days, studying her movements, the way she disappeared behind closed doors, the way she would linger outside their son's bedroom before slipping inside. And tonight was no different. He had expected her to go to bed, but instead she moved toward their son's room, slowly, carefully. She wasn't just checking in on him, she was waiting, watching. Then, after a moment, she turned the doorknob and stepped inside. The husband's pulse quickened. He had never questioned her role as a mother. She was strict, but loving, protective. But now, the doubts clawed at him. Why was she always in there? What was she doing? He counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. The door clicked shut. He exhaled, quietly moving forward. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to stop, to turn back, but something inside him wouldn't let him. He pressed his ear to the door. The room was silent at first. Then, a whisper. His son's voice. No. A chill ran down his spine. Another whisper, softer, her voice this time. It's okay, you know the rules. The husband didn't wait. He grabbed the doorknob, twisted, and shoved the door open. For a moment, the room was frozen in time. The wife's head snapped toward him, eyes flashing with something. Anger? Panic? Their son, unmoving, staring past him, as if he wasn't even there. His breath caught in his throat. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, his hands curled into fists at his sides. And then, he saw it. A small object in her hand, something he couldn't quite make out, but the look on her face said everything. Nothing could have prepared him for what he saw next. For a split second he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His eyes flickered between his wife and his son. And then, he saw it. The object in her hand, small, white, a pill bottle. His stomach turned. His son, pale, unmoving, eyes unfocused, was staring at the wall, not speaking, not blinking. The wife jolted to her feet, stuffing the bottle into her pocket. What are you doing? Her voice was sharp, defensive, but there was something else, something behind her eyes. Guilt. His son, still silent, gripped the sheets so tightly his knuckles turned white. The husband's voice came out hoarse. What did you give him? The wife shook her head. It's just to help him sleep. But something about the way she said it, the way she took a step forward, blocking the bed as if shielding their son from him, made his skin crawl. The pieces were falling into place. The way their son had been withdrawn, the way he had stopped speaking, the way his body seemed heavier, his movements slower. Was she drugging him? His hands clenched. Let me see the bottle. She didn't move, didn't blink. Go back to bed. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Let me see it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain battered the window. Their son let out a slow breath, barely audible. Then, she turned, moving toward the dresser, as if to put the bottle away. And that's when he lunged. The impact echoed in the silence. Small, round tablets rolled across the floor, stopping just inches from their son's feet. His wife gasped, twisting in his grip, trying to push him away. You don't understand. He shoved her back, chest heaving, eyes darting to the spilled pills. And that's when he saw the label. Not a sleep aid, not prescribed to their son, but something stronger, something dangerous. His hands shook. How long? She didn't answer. His voice cracked. How long have you been giving him this? Still, silence. And then, barely above a whisper, you don't understand, it was necessary. But necessary for what? Time slowed. The rain against the window, the pills scattered across the floor, the weight in his chest growing heavier with each passing second. His wife, his partner, was drugging their son, and she didn't deny it. She didn't even try. Instead, she stood there, calm, composed, as if this was something normal, as if he was the one who didn't understand. His voice shook. What do you mean, necessary? A flicker of something crossed her face. Regret? Fear? Or something else entirely? And then, she whispered, I did what I had to do. Her voice was steady, but her eyes darted toward the door, as if she was deciding whether to run. "You don't know what it's like," she said. "You're not here all the time. You don't see how difficult it is, how unpredictable he is. The meltdowns, the aggression, the stares from people when he loses control in public. You don't understand what it's like to live with that every single day." His stomach twisted. "He's our son." She didn't blink. "Exactly. And I had to do what was best for him, for us." Best for them? His son, barely conscious, barely functioning. Was this what she considered best? He shook his head. "You sedated him." "I helped him," she snapped. "I gave him peace. I gave us peace. Do you know what it's like to fight him every single night? To not know when he'll snap? This," she gestured to the pills on the floor. "This made everything easier." The air in the room thickened. He felt sick. He had known something was wrong for months, but this was worse than he could have imagined. "You poisoned him." Her jaw tightened. "You wouldn't understand. You're his mother." Silence. The only sound was the steady drip of the rain outside. For the first time, her expression cracked. Just slightly. Her hands trembled. But then, just as quickly, she pulled herself back together. She straightened her spine, voice cold. "You're overreacting. I'm a cop. I know what I'm doing." That single sentence sent a chill down his spine. He had spent years trusting her, believing in her judgment, and now that trust was shattered. She took a step forward. "You won't say anything. You won't do anything, because you know I did what was right." A challenge, a threat, a dare. And at that moment, something inside him snapped. The boy stirred slightly but didn't respond, his limbs heavy, his eyes unfocused. The husband's pulse pounded. He needed to get him out of here, now. But the wife, she didn't move. She simply stood there, watching, waiting. His grip tightened on his son's wrist. "I'm taking him." She tilted her head slightly. "No, you're not." His breath caught in his throat. Something about the way she said it, cold, unbothered, as if she had already decided how this night would end. He realized then that she wasn't going to let them go. And that's when the real nightmare began. His pulse pounded in his ears. He needed to get their son out, now. But she wasn't letting them leave. She was still, calm. Like she had already decided how this would end. And that terrified him more than anything. "Move," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't. Instead, she crossed her arms, eyes locked onto him. "Think about this. You take him out of here like this, and what do you think happens next?" His grip tightened on his son. "I don't care. I'm taking him." She exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "And then what? You call the police? I am the police. You think they're going to take your word over mine?" A chill ran down his spine. She was right. She had connections. Influence. If he tried to report this, would anyone believe him? Or would she twist the story, make it seem like he was the unstable one? She took a slow step forward. "Listen to me. We can fix this. You're upset, I get it, but you need to calm down before you do something you regret." Regret? He looked at his son, barely conscious, barely aware of what was happening, and something inside him hardened. He had no choice. He had to act. Now. It happened fast. Too fast. He yanked his son forward, gripping him under the arms. The boy was weak, sluggish from the drugs, barely able to stand. But they had to move. The wife's eyes widened, and then, she lunged. A sharp tug, a blur of motion. His son slipped from his grasp, collapsing back onto the bed. "Stop," she yelled, grabbing the husband's arm, nails digging into his skin. He twisted free, shoving her back, his heart pounding. She stumbled but didn't fall. Instead, she straightened. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her hands balled into fists. Then, for the first time, her mask slipped. "You don't get to take him from me," she spat. His blood ran cold. "He's not yours, he's ours." But she wasn't listening anymore. She was reaching for something at her waist. And that's when he saw it. His breath hitched. His mind screamed at him to move, but his body was frozen. Because in that split second, he understood exactly what was happening. She was reaching for her gun. "Don't," he warned, his voice shaking. But she ignored him, her fingers wrapped around the grip, pulling it free from the holster. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with something unspoken. Their son stirred, letting out a soft whimper from the bed. The husband swallowed hard. "Put it down." Her grip tightened. "You're making a mistake." His heart slammed against his ribs. He had seconds, maybe less. He needed to think. He needed a plan. But before he could move, before either of them could react, the situation took a turn no one expected. A single movement, a single miscalculation. That's all it would take for this to end in tragedy. The gun, the pills, the silence in the room. It all pointed to one thing. This was no longer a fight. It was a matter of survival. The wife's finger hovered over the trigger, her breathing steady. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't unsure. She was in control, and that terrified him more than anything. He took a slow step back, hands raised. "You don't have to do this." Her voice was eerily calm. "You're not taking him. You can't." His son stirred behind him, mumbling something too faint to hear. The drugs still had a hold on him, but he was waking up, and if he woke up fully, if he made a noise, if he panicked, he had to act now. The seconds stretched. He could hear his own heartbeat, the storm outside, the soft rustle of fabric as his son shifted. Then, a sound. Not from them, from outside. A car door slamming, footsteps on the driveway. Someone was outside. The wife's head snapped toward the window. The distraction was brief, less than a second, but it was enough. The husband lunged. His shoulder slammed into her, knocking her off balance. The gun wavered, jerking upward, the barrel flashing past his face as he grabbed for it. She gasped, twisting, fighting back. She was strong. Years of police training made sure of that. But he was fueled by something stronger. Pure, desperate fear. The gun was between them now, both of them gripping it, wrestling for control. "Let it go," he snarled. "You're ruining everything," she screamed. A violent jerk, a sharp twist, then, for a moment, neither of them moved. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. The storm outside raged on, and then, the wife gasped. She looked down. A dark stain spread across her side. She staggered, pressing a hand to the wound. Her fingers trembled. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The husband stood frozen, the weight of what had just happened crashing down on him. She swayed on her feet, her knees buckling, and then, she collapsed. A soft voice broke the silence. "Dad?" The husband's breath hitched. His son was awake, fully awake. The drugs were wearing off. The haze in his eyes was clearing. He looked at his father, then at his mother, motionless on the floor. Tears, what happened? The husband's throat tightened. How could he explain any of this? Before he could answer, before he could even move, the distant sirens grew louder. Flashing red and blue lights reflected against the rain-slicked windows. Someone had called the police, and they were almost here. But when the officers arrived, they would only hear one version of the story. The sirens grew louder, filling the night air. The driveway flooded with squad cars. Armed officers poured out, their hands hovering over their holsters. He knew what this looked like. A man standing over his wounded wife, a gun on the floor, his son dazed and confused. The moment they entered, they would make a split-second decision. And if he moved the wrong way, if he said the wrong thing, he wouldn't leave this house alive. Through the haze of fear, he only had time for one thought. What was she going to tell them? Before he could react, before he could explain, she spoke. Her voice was weak, barely more than a whisper, but the words that left her lips changed everything. He shot me. The world tilted. The officers froze, their eyes locked onto him, and in that moment, it was over. "Put your hands up." The words hit him like a bullet. "No," he shouted, shaking his head. "It wasn't like that. But they weren't listening. Get on the ground, now!" His son's voice broke through the chaos. "Dad!" The boy was terrified, confused. His eyes darted from his father to the police, to his mother on the floor. "Tell them," the husband begged, his voice cracking. "Tell them what she did." But the boy, drugged, disoriented, could barely process what was happening. And the officers weren't waiting. Cold metal snapped around his wrists, a knee pressed against his back, pinning him to the floor. The gun, the blood, his wife's uniform, that was all they saw. And in their eyes, he was the monster. "Dad?" His voice cracked, his hands trembling. He didn't understand, he couldn't. His world had just shattered in an instant. "Let him go." His cries echoed through the house, but no one listened. The officers moved like machines, dragging his father toward the door. The husband struggled. "Please, look at him. Look at what she did to him." No response, no hesitation, just the sound of heavy boots against the floor, the rain pounding outside, and his son's sobs following him out the door. The moment she was placed on the stretcher, she turned her head. Her gaze locked onto him, and then she smiled. A small, weak smile, just enough for him to see it. She had won. She had set the trap, and he had walked straight into it. As the paramedics carried her away, as the officers shoved him into the back of a squad car, as his son's screams echoed through the night, he realized something. She hadn't just planned this. She had expected it. But what she didn't expect was what would happen next. The room was cold, sterile. A single flickering light overhead cast sharp shadows across the walls. He had spent hours in a holding cell, replaying everything. The struggle, the gunshot, the look in his wife's eyes when she realized she had won. Now he was here, facing detectives who had already decided he was guilty. One of them leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "Tell us what happened." He exhaled slowly, his throat dry. "You have to listen to me. She's lying. You don't know what she's done." The detectives exchanged a glance. Skepticism. Doubt. Then the other one spoke. "That's not what she says." He stiffened. What did she say?" She had played the victim perfectly. She told them she had been arguing with her husband for weeks, that he had grown paranoid, controlling, that he accused her of cheating, of hiding something. She said she had tried to calm him down, but that night... "He snapped," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He came into our son's room, yelling, pushing me, and then he grabbed the gun." She closed her eyes, a single tear rolling down her cheek. "I tried to stop him. I begged him to put it down, but he just shot me." "That's a lie," he shouted, his chair scraping against the floor. "She drugged him. She's been—" A detective held up a hand. "Calm down. No, you don't understand. She's been drugging our son. You need to test him. Check his blood." The detectives exchanged another glance. Then, one of them slid a file across the table. "We already did." His heart pounded as he reached for the file. His hands shook as he flipped it open. The results were there, a full toxicology report. And his stomach dropped. Nothing. No traces of sedatives, no unusual substances, nothing that backed up his story. His voice was barely a whisper. "That's not possible." The detective sighed. "We tested him. He's clean." No. She had to have done something. You have to test again. You have to..." The results are final. The weight of it crushed him. His last shred of hope, gone. And then, the final blow. The detective leaned in, voice quiet. "We also spoke to your son." The boy had been disoriented, confused, but one thing was clear. He didn't remember anything. The night was a blur. He didn't know why his father was fighting with his mother. He didn't know why there was a gun. He just remembered waking up to his dad getting arrested. No accusations, no confirmations of his father's claims, just uncertainty. The detective closed the file, leaning back in his chair. "So, here's what we know. Your wife, a decorated police officer, was shot in her own home. Your son was found unharmed, but you were the only other person in the room. The gun was in your hands. And now, your wife is pressing charges against you for attempted murder. It was over. Or at least, it should have been. But then, a single unexpected clue surfaced, and it changed everything. It was supposed to be an open and shut case. A respected officer, nearly killed by her husband. A teenage boy with no memory of that night, and a man with no alibi. But then, a single detail caught a detective's eye. Something so small, so easily overlooked, that no one had questioned it before. The toxicology report. The boy's toxicology report, no sedatives, no unusual substances. It had come back completely clean. But something about it didn't sit right. There was one question no one had asked. If the boy hadn't been drugged, why had he been so unresponsive? Why had his body been limp, his eyes fluttering as if trapped in a heavy fog? The detective exhaled sharply. Something was missing. He decided to run a simple background check, not on the father, not on the son. On the mother. And that's when he saw it. Her name, her prescription history. A powerful sedative, a drug meant for severe insomnia. But the issue? She had no history of insomnia. No prior prescriptions before that year. And something else stood out. She had been refilling it for over a year. So if she wasn't taking it, who was? The detective's mind raced. He had seen cases like this before. He quickly pulled up the department's internal medical reports. The mother's last health evaluation, routine physical, standard tests. And something immediately stood out. Her toxicology screening. Clean, no sedatives, no prescription drugs. None of the medication that was supposedly prescribed to her. So if it wasn't in her system, where was it going? His stomach turned. There was only one possibility. The boy had been drugged. But if that was true, why had his toxicology report come back clean? Unless someone had covered it up. I want the lab to rerun the boy's blood sample. This time, I want an independent test outside our department. 2 days later, an email came through. A second toxicology report, and this time, the results were different. The boy's blood wasn't clean. There it was, the same sedative prescribed to his mother. The first test had been a lie. Someone had covered it up. Now there was no doubt, she had been drugging her own son. With this new information, detectives looked at the case from a different angle. The husband had claimed she was drugging their son, but without evidence, no one believed him. Now, there was proof that she had access to sedatives, that she had been filling prescriptions under her name, but using them on someone else. The pieces started to fall into place. And then, another crucial mistake was found. Initially, investigators believed the husband had shot his wife during a struggle. But something was off about the bullet's trajectory. If he had shot her at close range, as she claimed, the entry wound should have been at a different angle. The wound suggested something else, that she had been shot from farther away. And then a disturbing possibility emerged. Had she shot herself to frame him? With the new evidence, detectives returned to her hospital room. At first, she played the victim. She repeated her story, her voice trembling. "He tried to kill me." But when they presented the toxicology report, the prescription records, the bullet trajectory findings, she went silent. Her eyes darted to the door, her hands gripping the sheets. And for the first time, she had no explanation, because her carefully crafted lie was falling apart. But the most shocking discovery was still to come. For weeks, she had maintained her story. Her husband was abusive, controlling, dangerous. She had fought for her life that night. But now, she was cornered. Detectives had proof that she had been drugging their son, that her gunshot wound wasn't from a struggle but from a staged shooting. And then, they hit her with the final question. Why was your husband the only one fighting for your son's safety if you were the one meant to protect him? She didn't answer, not right away. Instead, her fingers tapped against the table. Once, twice, her jaw tightened. Then finally, I want a lawyer. After spending nearly a month in jail, the husband was finally released. But the damage had already been done. He had lost his job, his home, his reputation. And worst of all, his son had spent those weeks in the custody of the same woman who had been hurting him. But now, everything was different, because detectives had enough to charge her. As prosecutors built their case, a disturbing truth came to light. The wife had been manipulating her son for years. It started small, controlling his schedule, isolating him from his father. But then, she began drugging him. Experts suggested that she may have had a psychological disorder, one where a caregiver fabricates or causes illness in someone to gain sympathy and control. And the real reason she framed her husband, because he was beginning to suspect her. He had started documenting his concerns, reaching out to specialists. He was preparing to take legal action for full custody. And she couldn't let that happen. So she staged the entire attack, shot herself, lied to the police, made sure her husband looked like a violent man. And for a while, it worked. When the trial began, she refused to plead guilty. She stuck to her story, claiming she was the real victim. But the prosecution had evidence, witnesses, the son's medical records, the staged crime scene. But the most damning evidence? It wasn't in the police files. It wasn't in witness statements. It wasn't even in the crime scene photos. It was in the words of the boy himself, his journal entries. He had never spoken about it. Never told a teacher, never told a neighbor, but he had written everything down, every night, every detail. The entries started when he was 9. She says, I have to be stronger, that I have to stop crying, but it hurts. I stay quiet like she says, that's the rule. No talking, no looking up, no asking questions, just sit still, breathe slow, be good. Sometimes she's nice, sometimes she isn't, I don't know why, I just have to be better. As the years passed, the entries became shorter, more frantic, the words uneven, pressed hard into the paper. Don't move, don't breathe too loud, just wait for her to leave. I don't like the closet, it's too dark. I want to go home, but I am home. The entries stopped when he turned 14. Then her son took the stand, and that was when everything escalated. For the first time, away from her influence, he spoke freely, and what he said sealed her fate. It took the jury only 4 hours to decide. Guilty. She was convicted of multiple charges: attempted murder, child endangerment, falsifying police reports. She lost her badge, her career, her freedom. And as she was led away in handcuffs, she never once looked back at her son. After the trial, the husband was granted full custody. It took time to rebuild trust, to undo the damage left behind. But for the first time in years, his son was safe. A mother, a police officer, a woman sworn to protect. Instead, she became the very thing her family feared the most. And in the end, the truth couldn't stay buried forever. If you found this case as unbelievable as we did, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think justice was truly served? And if you want to hear more shocking true crime cases, don't forget to subscribe. Because trust me, the next story is even more disturbing.